Neat Nation, welcome back to the Droopy Whiskey Show, where I have with me today, for the first time in person, my friend Brian Bikey at AbandonBourbon. If you haven't already, you should check out his channel. We do a thing every Thursday night. We live stream. It's fun. It's dope. And if you're not watching that, then, I mean, you're wasting your Thursday nights, probably. I set a goal this year. What we're doing tonight is serving the goal that I set for myself, which was to taste, what did I say, 20?
20.
Yeah, 20 dusty whiskeys. And Brian has been kind enough to line up 4 for us to taste tonight. We have Heaven Hill, what did you say, 81?
That's 86 proof.
Well, I meant 81.
Yeah, the bottle stamp is 81 on the bottom, so that's what we're going with. We're assuming 81.
Okay, and then this is obviously not in the original bottle, but this is 1985 Old Forester Bonded. What do we have over there?
We've got 1985 Wild Turkey Decanter, also not in its original bottle. And then we have a 70s or 80s, I don't quite remember, Maker's Mark Mini that we're going to get into. I'm personally a big fan of the 80s makers.
Sure.
Really unique flavor, and we're just going to bust into some of these and see. Now, we have an older video, I think a stream,
yeah, it was a live
perhaps,
stream,
where we did kind of a blind flight through some Dusties, primarily Wild Turkey products, but none of these were featured in this. So these are going to be brand new Dusties for you, and one of your goals, too, was for a lot of those to be prior to 2015, right?
Well, it was all of them prior to 2015.
That's right.
Prior to 1995. I wanted 10 of them, and all 4 of these are pre-95.
Correct.
So, first, before we get into the tasting, which we'll try and do swiftly, but Brian, if I were to ask you a question, what's the deal with Dusties? As you like Dusties, you're into Dusties. What's the deal with Dusty whiskey?
Yeah, I mean, Dusty whiskey to me is just as with people when they talk about single barrels and they talk about snapshots in time, the ingredients, the yeast in some of these cases, specifically with the product we'll talk about, Heaven Hill, things were made differently. They came from wood that was different. You know, it's just a different era of whiskey, and I think the flavor profile shows that. I think that the biggest thing is that you have younger age-dated whiskey, but a ton of older stock that rolled into it because we came right out of the glut, right? And so a lot of people were sitting on a lot of old whiskey. And while that does go into products today, like we've talked about in other things with the Wild Turkey 101, Rare Breed, or even, you know, Evan Williams Black Label, you know, these are products where I think you can tell on the palate a little bit more.
Yeah, the age is probably a higher proportion of what's in the bottle. Old Forester Signature is probably another one today that has some old stocks, even though it's a bottom shellfish brand. But the allure for like a whiskey geek is, I mean, obviously the rarity on these is you know, beyond anything we can just go get off the shelf today. Of course, the rarity is probably on par with some of the more exclusive releases like Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. But, you know, I think there's also the appeal that it's from a bygone era. I mean, all of these were made before I was born. I was born in '89. All these were bottled before I was born. So not only were they sitting in a barrel for a while, but then they've just been sitting in the bottle in somebody's basement, in somebody's cupboard, whatever, just untouched. So to actually ingest something into your body from that long ago is just a kind of bizarre experience.
But I also think there's a lot of people out there who understand the sentiment of going after a birthday bourbon for their kids or trying to find sentimental bottles that represent the years. Was there a Blanton's with a dump date of an important date that means something to me? And, you know, similar to me, I was born in 1985, so finding bottles or decanters that came from 85
pretty cool.
Was something that I wanted. So instead of chasing a George T. Stagg or, you know, some sort of highly allocated unicorn type whiskey, to me, finding something that was just around that date was more important to me.
Yeah. The last thing I'd say in terms of the deal with Dusties is it's a fun learning experience. You can go to a bar generally, find one in a city near you that has some of the allocated releases from this year that you can taste, but you know, it's pretty rare to find Dusty bars. There are some, of course, in and around Kentucky, but not really in Wisconsin where you can taste these super old pours. It's just a harder experience to come by in general, let alone finding a bottle for yourself. All right, let's taste through this lineup.
Yep.
We're going to go in order of proof. We're going to start with this Heaven Hill Black, which black, I mean, obviously doesn't exist today. This is age stated at 4 years old, 86 proof.
And again, this is pre-Fire Heaven Hill, 86 proof, but that's something a lot of people had looked for before, and it's that's all I know about it.
The nose on modern Heaven Hill products is generally pretty nutty, especially. I don't even say especially. Gosh. Especially the bottom shelf products. This being in a hip flask, and, it's signaling, I think, that this was not exactly top shelf even at the time. So it'd be an interesting comparison. Nose isn't screaming nuttiness now, but it's not too dissimilar from like an Evan Williams single barrel.
No, and one of the
which is in that 86 proof range.
Yeah, and one of the last times that I had this with a buddy of mine, we had this back to back with Evan Williams 23.
Oh, really?
Which completely different type of pour, very much old whiskey, and a little bit higher proof. But I think for enjoyment, we actually preferred this one just because of some of the flavors that it brought. Maybe it's because it's more unassuming.
Yeah, it's really straightforward. It's like vanilla beans and honey. It's not the most rich ever, but it's got a really nice viscosity to it.
I feel like there's something in a lot of Dusties that I always say it kind of leans towards either a maple-like sweetness or like a salted caramel-like sweetness. There's definitely something to the sweetness that I feel like is generally a through line in a lot of Dusties, and we'll get to that. But there's also a characteristic to it that I do notice in older aged whiskeys, Remus even, for example, where you get those kind of puckering, almost sour fruit notes.
That's the second time you've used puckering as an adjective.
Did I really?
Yeah, right. Or I guess maybe that's an adverb. No, puckering to notes. It's puckerly. It's an adjective.
The puckeringness. The puckeringness.
It's got a little bit of old library. Like I get a little old library book. Kind of retro nasal. I get caramely, and maybe a touch of like salted caramel, kind of tactile. It's fallen short of maple for me. I just don't get the depth. I don't get like a pronounced oak. It doesn't taste youthful. It's not grainy. It's a little musty on there.
Yeah, that's a good word to put it. It's kind of got that musty library kind of funk to it.
Yeah. So that one was a pretty nice way to start. Now we're on to the makers, which is 90 proof. And again, did we get a date? We texted the guy for a date. But
no, did not get a date. Still don't have a date.
I'm surprised the wax isn't even more brittle.
Oh, screw top, so that makes it easy. But yeah, it is either from the 70s or the 80s. Not quite sure yet.
This one's not as musty on the nose. It's really hard to pick out notes for me right now. I got the COVID.
Yeah, I feel like it's got the same sort of nose that I get on today's makers.
Yeah,
honestly, it's like kind of like the cashew or something like that, mixed with a little bit of what I would
French
call
oaky
sawdust. Yeah, and I think you notice it a lot on the palate too. To be honest, I think I expected this to be a little bit more different than this. It's like a slightly more drying version of kind of a modern maker's profile still.
It has zero heat. So like a modern maker's is still, I think, going to deliver some like tongue tingling, like, oh. So one of the things I wonder about these Dusties, and when we tasted that initial lineup on the live, was even some of the higher proof ones just taste so mellowed out. And I don't know if that's evaporation. Like obviously we don't have a way to actually measure alcohol content. But that was sealed with wax.
Right.
So I doubt that there's...
Screw top too. I mean, we know that it didn't have... any leakage there really. Now the more we sit with it, the more both the nose and the palate kind of open up to be what is that kind of dusty tell to me. A little bit more funk comes out.
Yeah, if we were tasting this blind, I don't think I could call it out as a dusty, but I'd be like, man, that's really interesting because it's so easy to drink and it's so like pure vanilla. Like it reminds me of our vanilla bean syrup at Stone Creek Coffee that we use for like a vanilla latte. And we make it with vanilla beans. So it's like vanilla beans and simple syrup. Again, no youthful grains, no pronounced like oaky depth.
It's a little fragrant on the palate. That's one thing that
kind of florally.
I'm not sure if, while we just mentioned that there wouldn't necessarily be evaporation, one thing that kind of can happen in Dusties too, whether it's because of oxygen getting in or what, you can get like a perfuminess.
Yeah.
And not in a you can mean that in a light, fragrant way, but I'm meaning it in like was this in my grandma's house next to her perfume sort of way? Like an over-exaggerated perfuminess is slightly there as it kind of sits in the glass a little.
Yeah, I don't take it like rose petals or lavender or anything. If anything, more of a honeysuckle. It's inviting for me. Like, this is too crushable. Like, if I'm drinking this...
Dangerous.
Oh, yeah. Like, because I don't feel like I'm drinking whiskey, almost. Like, it's so chill.
Slightly a bit in, like, a brandy or, like, a Armagnac kind of camp.
Yeah.
Because there is some fruitiness and some sweetness.
Yeah, kind of
with a little bit of that mustiness.
Out, yeah. I mean, so on the brandies or yaks, that appliness or perriness can really punch, like, and hit you. So, but I do think the tactile and sweetness is very reminiscent of those products. Number 3, we're moving to this 1985 Old Forester Bonded, so 100 proof. I was just picking it up and looking at it, and I mean, for 100 proof whiskey, that's looking like it has some wood influence, which is appealing to me.
I got this from a friend. I initially thought that it was in like a normal 750 or like a liter size bottle. Wasn't? No, it was he had like a handle of it.
Oh, kid out.
And poured me out some of it. So, that's another thing that's just, you don't see as much, but some of the older whiskeys too, I mean, they have them now. They have handles of whiskey, but, these just seem like they're a bigger to-do now, so I think it takes me by surprise that it would have a handle, but of course they would, because this is, for the most part, probably pretty bottom shelf stuff.
I don't get any of the sort of modern Old Forester banana, which is kind of the first thing that gives away Brown-Forman product.
I feel like it's more like an almond or almond paste or something like that. Kind of little cherry, little almond note.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. This one is much more rich. Like, it conveys time in a barrel more than the first 2 whiskeys did. It also smells a little bit more punchy, too, compared to the first 2. Like, that, I expect I'm going to feel that 100 proof. It's nice. It's real nice. It has the silky viscosity that these other 2 had initially on the tongue. Nice vanilla sweetness. I'm just stuck on vanilla today. But it gets way deeper a lot faster. So it shifts into caramel and then even brown sugar, like the further it moves back on the palate. And then it hits with some spices, again, that these other first two pours didn't have.
I don't feel like it has as much of the spice or heat like maybe a modern signature 100 or something like that will. But what you do get
nutty funkiness.
No, but you do notice the char a little bit. I feel like you can tell that there's a little bit more of a barrel char to this, and it's really pleasing to me.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really good pour.
Still has a little bit of citrus that the other ones didn't have.
I get a minty finish too.
Good spice to it.
So sound cut out on us, but what we're saying about the Old Forester is it's nice and rich. Like, it's not overly complex, but it delivers good age, like a nice balance of oak, sweetness, leather with some light spice, and then this kind of minty complexity. And overall, it just lends itself to being pretty rad. It's something that you want to drink. I mean, it's not as drinkable as maybe the other two where you could just slam them, but it's something that I want to drink more of because it was such a pleasant experience.
Yeah, I think it lingers the most on the palate too.
Yeah.
And the flavors that I talked about it kind of off air, I feel like this is the one that reminds me the most like Russell's 13 in a way. You got some of the barrel char, you got some mint, you got some spice, you got a little bit of this kind of cherry fruit note, kind of leans on grape, and then it lingers the best. I think it's definitely solid.
Like a Diet Russell's 13.
Diet Russell's 13.
All right. What's the last one, Brian?
Last one we're going to get into is also from 1985, and it happens to be a Wild Turkey Decanter. So these are a mixed bag. You never know what you're going to get when you get into a decanted product.
Lead poisoning.
A little bit of lead poisoning, maybe, perhaps. So, please drink abundantly.
Slightly. Little bits at a time.
And the problems with decanters is you don't necessarily, if you're getting them from a cellar or if you're getting them from a yard sale, wherever you get it from, you don't know what its quality is going to be like. You could get something super cloudy. You can't see inside of it. If it has evaporation, you might have really funky smells. You might have a lot of evaporation loss. You could have anything once you get this out of the decanter. Yeah. But this one ended up having a really good yield, and you can tell it's got really good color. So for the most part, we can assume that it's kept some good quality to it. And the nose is great.
Some buttercreamy. There is a metallic-y kind of element Little pennies. You call out pennies sometimes, not as a negative note, but as a note.
Yeah.
And I'm going to call it out here on the nose.
There's definitely a little bit more.
Buttercream pennies.
Buttercream pennies with a little bit more of like a cinnamon and baking spice present. I mean, we thought that this one was a little spicier than the two. This one definitely kind of cuts a little bit more striking with the spice.
And it's this has some funky nuttiness too that's pretty similar to some turkeys now, some Russell's picks that I've had. So this one, if I were to call out, granted we're not doing this blind, but if I'm having to pick a distillery and you said which one's turkey, I would hope I would go like, oh, this one, if I'm just going off the nose. So much happening here.
For being only, what, 1 proof point higher, it's definitely the fullest of them all.
There's so much happening here. Like, it does have a buttercreamy sweetness, but it is... I mentioned library. I'm not getting musty paper on this one, but I'm getting like Rick House. I'm getting old building kind of vibes.
Mm-hmm. I feel especially as you let it sit in the mouth a little bit more, there's a lot of brown sugar, but it's like really big, mature, woody, not quite tannic, but it's definitely right where I like it.
But it's definitely woody, and to me, it's like signal. This one to me tastes the most dusty. Like it's the most old building, like Mondo timbers, funky, but not. I mentioned, I think what was the second one we had?
The Makers.
That one I was getting library, or was it the Heaven Hill? One of these I was getting library on. This one's less library, but it's still very old building kind of vibes with big sweetness though. Now, there's no note that's particularly off-putting. I don't mind that old building vibe because it's like, oh, this is antique.
So on the nose, you said that it, reminded you of some other products, from Wild Turkey. How do you feel about the palate? Do you agree with that same thing with the palate?
It's not too dissimilar from Decades. Decades kind of drinks slightly below its proof point, pretty chill, and has this sweet, kind of understated front that then finishes with a decent amount of oak. Really enjoyable pour, very fine. Like it's not extraordinary, but it's very good. This one probably delivers a little bit more richness, but it's probably not as refined. Like even now as it sits on the palate, like the tongue sensations I get is pretty dry. Maybe not as floral as Decades, but more sweet. Mm-hmm. Maybe a little more woody throughout too. Definitely more funky. This one's definitely more funky than Decades.
Doesn't that definitely? I still think the through line to all these is like a slight bit of perfuminess, but definitely a little bit of musty funk to it.
Here's the musty funk. So that's 4. That's 4 Dusties and a little bit of walkthrough. Like why people I think would seek these out is generally, I mean, it seems like old bourbon is good bourbon. And I'll put a strike through, like does not equal, old does not equal, or like Dusties do not equal good, because to Brian's point earlier about the decanters, like they have to be stored correctly. There's a lot of risk in buying Dusty decanters, and not all the products that were made back in the day were good. Some of them were awful, like particularly rectified whiskey, which that's a whole episode in and of itself. That said, if you're getting old bourbon or dusty bourbon from distilleries that were generally known to be doing good things, like a lot of the national distillers brands, like Wild Turkey, like everything on the table, you can probably be pretty sure that it's not going to suck.
How do you feel about these, knowing that all 4 of these are products that are still made today, but different? Do you think that there's enough to signify, oh, that's a different take on them, or do you think that they're just a slightly different version of? Yeah,
I mean, everything's going to evolve. Like I said, the Heaven Hill, I wouldn't necessarily peg it as Heaven Hill. It doesn't have the classic nut profile that Heaven Hill does today. The Old Forester was lacking the banana note that seems to be present in the brown form and
Sounds like
yeast.
A win to me.
But the Makers and the Wild Turkey were probably the most similar to the profile as they exist today. I don't know that any of them are like, oh, that's the old profile is better than the new profile, but it is different. And it does seem like, for whatever reason, when you open these bottles that have been closed for so long, they tend to taste pretty good. Is that all in the head? I don't know. All right, y'all. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. We got a lot more content either coming to you from Kentucky or stuff we've already dropped, because I don't know when I'm going to release this video. So get down in the show notes or stay tuned. And as always, check back in with us Thursday nights, 8 o'clock for live streams. Till then, y'all. stay healthy, stay safe, and keep it neat.
Cheers, guys.